Welcome to the March 2023 edition of Inside Voices, a well-read magazines between the pages podcast. I'm your host, Robert Gwaltney, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Paulette Kennedy today as our guest, who is a fiction writer. Welcome, Paulette.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Before we begin, I want to share a little bit about you with our listeners. Originally from the Ozarks, Paulette Kennedy now divides her time between her Missouri hometown and Los Angeles, where she lives with her family and a menagerie of rescue pets. When she isn't writing, she enjoys tending to her garden, knitting, and finding unique vintage treasures at thrift stores and flea markets. As a history lover, she can get lost for days in her research, learning everything she can about the places in her stories and what her characters might have experienced in the past. So you had me at rescue pets.
Yes. Okay. So we've had like rotating rescue pets throughout the years, but right now we have 6 cats. We have 6 cats, a dog, and a snake. So
menagerie. Yeah, the snake.
Yeah. So that keeps us pretty busy. I inherited my mom's cats after she passed away this fall. And so that's why we have so many cats. And then our dog, we adopted him, about 4 years ago, shortly after we moved to California.
So we currently have two little rescue dogs as well. A Chihuahua, actually 2 Chihuahuas. One is sort of a mix. We're not quite sure his provenance, but we have 2 rescue dogs as well. So I like to connect. I'm glad that we were able to connect on that.
Yeah, ours is a rescue mixed. He's a mixed Chihuahua too. We're not really sure exactly what he's mixed with. We're thinking American Eskimo because he's very fluffy and he kind of has a little bit of a yodeling bark when he barks, but we don't know for sure. He's a happy little mutt, but he's very bonded to my husband. So
he's bonded to the husband.
Yes. They pick their people.
Absolutely. So Paulette, your first novel, Parting the Veil, which I very much enjoyed, was released November 1st, 2021 to much acclaim. And just 2 years later, readers are fortunate to have this book, The Witch of Tin Mountain, in their hands. I'm always interested to learn about an author's journey. Would you mind sort of highlighting your road to publication for us?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things. I always enjoyed reading. I was an avid reader from the time I could read. My mom taught me how to read before I started kindergarten, and she was an avid reader. And so she kind of encouraged my love of reading. And so every summer I would go to the library because we were very poor growing up, so we couldn't afford to buy books. And I would check out this huge stack of books and I would just read through them in no time. That's what I did in the summer, especially. I would just sit on the front porch and I would read. And so I had that love of reading, and then that kind of morphed into a love of writing. And some of my elementary school teachers really encouraged me and said that I had an aptitude. And so I was like, well, maybe someday I'll be a writer, as children do. And then life, kind of took me on some detours. And I did kind of dabble with writing commercial fiction a little bit whenever I was in college, but I didn't pursue publication really seriously until I was in my 40s. And I kind of transitioned out of my career as a photographer because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that all the way up until I retired, because it's a very strenuous job, especially wedding photography, which is what I was doing. And so with my husband's encouragement, I really started digging deep, and I finished the manuscript that would become Parting the Veil. And I put it through several rounds of revisions, and then I started querying. And I was pleasantly surprised at the response from agents. I wasn't really expecting it to go as well as it did. But even though I had a good request rate, there were no takers. So nobody was offering representation. So I pulled it back for one more revision. And then I entered a pitch contest on Twitter that's no longer going. It's called PitMad. And my pitch went viral. My tweets went viral during that contest. I got a lot of agent interest. And long story short, my agent ended up offering representation a couple weeks later. And I had another offer of representation that I needed to kind of pursue back and forth. And then I accepted my agent's offer, and she's wonderful. She's still my agent. And then we went on sub, and oh gosh, about 8 weeks later or so, we got our offer from my publisher. So that's kind of
Wow.
the long story.
8 weeks. That's pretty amazing. And you're with Lake Union, correct?
Yes, I'm with Lake Union. Yeah.
Lake Union. I heard in a podcast interview, I hear you recall saying that publication can be a matter of luck and of timing. For our listeners, do you mind sharing what you mean by that? And I totally agree, by the way.
Yeah. I do think I was incredibly lucky, and the timing was good because I kind of came in as the Gothic wave was starting to crest a little bit. So Silvia Moreno Garcia had just released Mexican Gothic. There was kind of this Gothic renaissance that was emerging, which I've always loved the Gothic, as you have, and I've always read Gothic novels even before they came back into vogue. But I kind of got lucky with the timing. That's really what it comes down to. I'd written this Gothic novel, and it was just like kind of waiting there, ready to be snatched up, and that's kind of what happened. But like sometimes, like some of the other books that I had written at a younger age, that I shelved, they were kind of not in the same vein, but kind of in the same vein. And I might revisit those at some point, when I think they might be a better fit for the market. Because some of them are just plain historical fiction. But I happened to get my agent because she was looking for a Gothic novel. Like, she was really looking, and it was really about luck. And as I said in my interview for Well Read that you sent me, I really believe that it's kind of akin to standing in front of a craps table at a casino. So you have to have a little bit of skill to play craps. You kind of have to know a little bit about what you're doing. But like, ultimately it comes down to luck and timing and how the dice fall. And I just happened to get really lucky. And I'm very honest about that when newer writers ask me, well, how did you get published? I kind of wish that I had the story that I queried like 1,000 agents and things like that before I got my offer, but that wasn't how it happened. And I spent a long time learning to be a writer. I spent a long time studying craft. I put a lot of work into that. And I think that is probably the part of the equation that I feel like I can be proud of as far as like what I did to get myself published. I really put in the time and the work of learning craft. And I got critique, and I actively sought out, finding help, editorial help and otherwise, from other authors and from an editor that I worked with before I was published. And so I think that it's a combination of things, but yes, luck and timing is a lot of it. Like, I think that writers that have a huge backlist of already written manuscripts are in a really good place whenever they do get their offer, because they've got this whole library of potential books that they can pull out and like present to their agent when the timing is right. And so I tend to, since I don't have that, I have a bunch of partial manuscripts, but I don't have anything, that was finished before I got my offer. I kind of pitch ideas to my agent. So I'll pitch 3 different ideas, and we'll say, I'll talk to her about it. I'm like, okay, which one of these do you think would be the best fit for the market? Because she knows the market and she knows what's selling because she's in the middle of it with all the editors. And so that's why I think agents are such a big boon for writers. They really help us to get our work out there and to sell it.
Exactly. Well, and you're right. You have to, a little bit of it is luck, but a lot of it too is just really good writing, which you certainly bring to the table. The Witch of Tin Mountain, since this is your sophomore book and it's just recently made its way out into the world, would you like to just sort of share your elevator pitch, provide our listeners with a brief overview of the book?
Yeah, so The Witch of Tin Mountain is my Southern Gothic that's set in the Ozarks, and it follows 3 generations of women who are haunted by a generational curse. So this generational curse, I don't want to give too much away about the root of the curse, but it's how they each one grapple with the curse and what happens after it. And the 3 main characters their stories are separated by 50 years. So it's a generational story. And it's one of those tales that's very personal to me. And I wanted to tell a story about the Ozarks set in my home state, the area that I grew up in. And so that's why I kind of chose to set it where I did. I felt like it was a really good setting for that kind of story. But ultimately, the story is about how these three women who are rumored witches go about freeing themselves from this generational curse.
So I'm going to share just some wonderful things that people have had to say about your latest book. This is from Hester Fox, author of A Lullaby for Witches. Kennedy weaves an achingly beautiful tale full of dark folklore, powerful women, and spine-tingling suspense. Deirdre's and Graceland's stories will grab you by the heart and stay with you long after the last page. Pretty darn nice thing to say, isn't it?
Yes, Hester is wonderful. She's an amazing Gothic author herself. She's written quite an extensive catalog of wonderful Gothic stories, and I'm very, very grateful that she endorsed this book.
So does it feel like when you hear someone say something so lovely, does it feel like they're actually talking about you?
No, no, it's none of this still feels real. I tell people that all the time. I don't know when it will feel like it's me and my book and my work. I mean, I'm very proud of like how far I've come, but none of this really feels like it's happened. It feels like a dream. So
Well, I'm going to share what Olivia Hawker, best-selling author of One for the Blackbird, One for the Crow, has to say. Brilliant and enthralling. The Witch of Tin Mountain left me breathless. Gracie and Deidre are two unforgettable characters, and their stories twine in an intricate braid of complex beauty. Kennedy has secured her place as one of the very best in historical fiction. Congratulations, just wonderful.
thank you. Yeah, Olivia, she is an amazing author and friend as well. And again, another author who has several bestsellers with my publisher, and I admire her greatly. So to have her endorsement is, again, so flattering, and it's an honor.
Where would you say in general that you draw your inspiration from for your writing, Paulette?
Oh, goodness. I think that a lot of my inspiration comes from my research. I've always been an avid nonfiction reader. So I'll often happen upon things like either in a documentary that I'm watching or a nonfiction book that I'm reading that spur an idea. And it really depends. Like my idea for The Witch of Tin Mountain, it kind of came from some of my family history, like with oral storytelling that my dad did. He was from Tennessee originally, and he was kind of the son of sharecroppers, and he grew up during the Great Depression. And so there were a lot of personal anecdotes that kind of came into play. And I put a lot of those in the book. And then, just wanting to write a story based in the Ozarks. That was a big part of it. And also probably the root of the plot and the actual haunting within the book, the curse, is mostly inspired by the Bell Witch legend out of Tennessee, which was something that, was familiar to my dad as well. And so that's kind of where I got the inspiration for the actual curse and what happens to the women within the story. It's very loosely based on that. I think we were both an admirer of William Gay. We've talked about that before. His Little Sister Death is also about the Bell Witch. And I read that, and that really helped kind of inform a little bit of my decision to set that story in a different place, have a different setting, have a little bit of a different take on it. I really enjoyed that. I wish it had been finished, but of course he passed away before he could fully finish that book. And as far as my next one, it's kind of, the idea for that one kind of fell out of the sky. It just kind of came to me one day. I was putting away groceries and the title and everything came to me. So it's kind of funny how that happens sometimes. I think just being open to inspiration and letting it find you. And often my ideas find me whenever I'm not writing. So taking breaks is important too.
Absolutely. So I find it interesting that the title came to you. Did a title come to you before you had the plot fully formed? Did you have just this sort of string of words, and then did you sort of back into the plot?
A little bit, yeah. So it was during the time period where I was taking care of my mother. And so I had just done her grocery shopping. I was putting the groceries away and in the refrigerator. And this title just came out of the blue, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport. I'm like, what is this? And I started thinking about what about if I wrote a story that centered a 1950s homemaker who developed psychic abilities just all of a sudden. And then that kind of got me thinking about who is this woman? Who is Mrs. Davenport? And what's important to her? And what does she want out of life? And so that's kind of that was the genesis of that idea.
So within The Witch on Tin Mountain, you've achieved a compelling cast of characters. I'm gonna give you a name and just tell me what first comes into your mind when I reference this character's name. I'm gonna begin with Reverend Josiah Bellwether.
Oh, goodness. Sly.
Great character.
He's the fox in the hen house. He's that archetype. Yes.
Trouble.
Yes.
Annalise.
Tender. A very kind person, like very loving.
Graceland.
Feisty.
And Deirdre.
Naive.
So I have a Freaky Friday question of sorts for you. If you had to trade places with one of your characters in either of your novels, with whom would you trade and why?
That's such a tough question. As I mentioned, it's just, oh my goodness, I put them through so much. I put my characters through so much, and there's always hope there. And so far, all my books have a happy ending. But it would probably be Deirdre. I feel the most kinship to her character because she's the most like me, or how I was in my youth. I would love to like shake her and make her like have some different decisions and choices within the book, but then we wouldn't really have the book that we have if she did that. So I really think that she's an interesting character. I think that she has a lot of different dichotomies and complexities. She's a flawed character. Every one of my characters has an internal flaw. And that's something I really love to explore with my work is I don't really have any characters that are just perfect paradigms of humanity. So I enjoy kind of exploring the darker side of human nature a little bit.
Me too. I think that makes for exciting fiction.
Yes.
You and I both share an admiration for a certain writer, not William Gay. I'm not referencing him, in one of their characters, their protagonist. I'm going to read, then this is a bit of a game. I'm going to read a few sentences, and I'm going to see if you can tell me the author and the character. And I'll help you if you get stumped. I am 18 years old, and I live with my sister Constance. I've often thought that with any luck at all, I could have been born a werewolf because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length. But I've had to be content with what I had.
Oh, that's Mary Cat from We Have Always Lived in the Castle, my all-time favorite Gothic heroine.
Absolutely. Oh my God. Yes. Just a perfect novel. And Paulette, I had not read that novel until, I don't know, maybe 5 or so years ago. And a member of my critique group, Jeff Blocker, said, have you ever read Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle? And I said, no. And I was just mesmerized. I don't know how I made it that far through life without having read that book. Wonderful. She was a master, Shirley Jackson, of the Gothic genre. And of course, I'm a huge fan, as are you. You write in that genre. And that's why I'm, of course, drawn to your writing. How do you personally define the Gothic genre, and what about it fuels your own interest?
Well, there are lots of different things that fuel my interest in it. And I love that you brought up Shirley Jackson because the heroine in my next novel is partially inspired by Shirley. And there are little nods and Easter eggs of Shirley's work all throughout the next book. Because, Shirley was a homemaker as well before she became a writer. And even whenever she did become an author, a very successful author, she went to the hospital one night. I think she had to go to the emergency room for some reason. And the attendant asked what her occupation was, and she said writer, and he wrote down homemaker. And so I put a lot of like Shirley wrote a lot about family life too. That's a part of her work that maybe isn't as well known as her Gothic work, but she wrote whole volumes and novels and articles about family life, about what it was like to raise children and have kind of the suburban lifestyle. And so that's like a whole other aspect of her writing. But going back to the Gothic and what attracts me to it, just kind of like what I was saying earlier, it's a great vehicle to explore the darker side of human nature. It's a way to explore politics. It's a way to explore religion. It's a way to explore a lot of different things that compel us as people. And there's just a lot of rich fodder for story. And I'd mentioned, I think that one of the things that one of my friends says about the Gothic really rings true. Chris Waldhair, she is an amazing author, and she says that the Gothic is dread mixed with desire.
Oh.
And I think that that is just a really succinct way to sum it up. I totally agree. There's something about Gothic fiction that is very sensual, and not just from a sexual like standpoint. I mean, that can definitely be part of it, but I see a lot of like just engaging the senses, all five senses, and even the sixth sense when we're talking about psychic ability, which is a big part of my next book. There's just a whole sensual like drawing in that happens with the atmosphere in Gothic fiction. The atmosphere is a huge part of it. And I love the whole aesthetic around Gothic fiction. I love cemeteries, old houses, old churches. All of that is very appealing to me. So I really feel like Gothic fiction is a way to aesthetically explore some of the more compelling aspects of being human. I mean, even as far back as like Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, I mean, that was an amazing exploration of good intentions gone awry. And that often happens. There are a lot of anti-heroes in Gothic fiction. I enjoy those characters a lot.
Absolutely. I think I recall some comparison, perhaps one of your novels, something was referenced about Sarah Waters.
Yes.
Sarah Waters fan.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Big Sarah Waters fan. Yeah, I know our mutual friend Kim Taylor Blakemore is also
yes,
a big Sarah Waters fan.
Who loves to write in the Gothic vein as well. But my favorite Sarah Waters book is Affinity.
Yes, that's a great one.
So atmospheric, and I always pull it out every October. There's something about pairing that with the month of October that I find oddly comforting.
Yeah, I'll have to read that again in October. It's been a few years since I read that one. So
such a wonderful book. So in closing, Paulette, when reflecting back on The Witch of Tin Mountain and your creative journey with that book, what would you say that this novel taught you?
This novel taught me to write what I know, bravely, even though it was scary. It was very personal for me. And in a lot of ways, this novel is kind of me just like presenting myself to the world in a way that I haven't before. And I really want to embrace that going forward. Like my first novel, I'm very proud of it. And I did put a lot of work into that novel. That novel was more of my homage to the Gothic romance. I really have always wanted to write a Gothic romance because that was my first introduction to the genre. My mom introduced me to Jane Eyre and to Wuthering Heights whenever I was young. Those were two of her favorite books. She loved the Brontes. And so that was kind of my homage to that subgenre within the Gothic. But going forward, I think like my Gothic fiction is going to be very much a little bit more grounded in what I really, really know well. And I feel like people are responding to that with this book, and hopefully that will go forward with the next. So,
Paulette Kennedy, it has been lovely spending time with you today. Thank you so much for coming in today and to have a conversation about your writing. I am a huge fan.
Well, I'm a huge fan of your writing too, Robert. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And gentle listeners, until next time, I'm Robert Gwaltney.